Thank you for joining and welcome back to part 2 in a 5-part series covering the 5W's of dyslexia, where we cover everything to do with appropriate intervention and advocacy for children with dyslexia. This is part 2, where we're going to define the second W. So we already covered why the system is broken for all of our kids, but especially for our struggling readers in part 1. Now let's answer the what of the 5W's. So what is dyslexia all about? We're going to cover myths, strengths, what it means, how the dyslexic brain functions, and all of that. So I've thrown a lot of these memes in for our audience as we move through all 5 parts. And I'm sure that many of you know this all too well. This is one from the well-respected Dr. Kelly Sandman Hurley. It can also feel like you're banging your head against a wall. So let's go deeper into what dyslexia is and how it looks different from our children who are just simply not receiving appropriate instruction. Okay, we can open the discussion with this classic video on dyslexia by Dr. Sandman Hurley. Dr. Kelly Sandman Hurley, excuse me.
Take a moment to read the following. How was that? Frustrating? Slow? What were those sentences about? They're actually a simulation of the experience of dyslexia, designed to make you decode each word. Those with dyslexia experience that laborious pace every time they read. When most people think of dyslexia, they think of seeing letters and words backwards, like seeing B as D and vice versa, or you might think people with dyslexia see saw as was. The truth is, people with dyslexia see things the same way as everyone else. Dyslexia is caused by a phonological processing problem, meaning people affected by it have trouble not with seeing language, but with manipulating it. For example, if you heard the word cat and then someone asked you remove the C, what word would you have left? Cat. This can be difficult for those with dyslexia. Given a word in isolation like fantastic, students with dyslexia need to break the word into parts to read it. Fan-tas-tic. Time spent decoding makes it hard to keep up with peers and gain sufficient comprehension. Spelling words phonetically like S-T-I-K for stick and F-R-E-N-S for friends is also common. These difficulties are more widespread and varied than commonly imagined. Dyslexia affects up to 1 in 5 people. It occurs on a continuum. One person might have mild dyslexia, while the next person has a profound case of it. Dyslexia also runs in families. It's common to see one family member who has trouble spelling, while another family member has severe difficulty decoding even one-syllable words like catch. The continuum and distribution of dyslexia suggest a broader principle to bear in mind as we look at how the brains of those with dyslexia process language. Neurodiversity is the idea that because all our brains show differences in structure and function, we shouldn't be so quick to label every deviation from the norm as a pathological disorder, or dismiss people living with these variations as defective. People with neurobiological variations like dyslexia, including such creative and inventive individuals as Picasso, Muhammad Ali, Whoopi Goldberg, Steven Spielberg, and Cher, clearly have every capacity to be brilliant and successful in life. So here's the special way the brains of those with dyslexia work. The brain is divided into 2 hemispheres. The left hemisphere is generally in charge of language and ultimately reading, while the right typically handles spatial activities. fMRI studies have found that the brains of those with dyslexia rely more on the right hemisphere and frontal lobe than the brains of those without it. This means when they read a word, it takes a longer trip through their brain and can get delayed in the frontal lobe. Because of this neurobiological glitch, they read with more difficulty. But those with dyslexia can physically change their brain and improve their reading. With an intensive multisensory intervention, that breaks the language down and teaches the reader to decode based on syllable types and spelling rules. The brains of those with dyslexia begin using the left hemisphere more efficiently while reading, and their reading improves. The intervention works because it locates dyslexia appropriately as a functional variation in the brain, which naturally shows all sorts of variations from one person to another. Neurodiversity emphasizes this spectrum of brain function in all humans and suggests that to better understand the perspectives of those around us, we should try to not only see the world through their eyes, but understand it through their brains.
All right, I love that video. I use it for so many presentations. I think it just so clearly explains visually and auditorily what's going on. So here's the industry standard of definition of dyslexia. I'm going to go deeper in some of the terms in the next slide, but as an overview, it's neurobiological in origin, meaning you're born with it. It's a deficit in the phonological component of language. Now, we can see it early in the brain, but it's usually not until student has trouble with accurate or fluent reading, they have poor spelling and decoding and poor comprehension that we identify it. But most importantly, to understand, it's an unexpected gap between where performance should be and where it is based on a pattern of evidence. And we see this through norm reference testing. Now I'm going to break down that term phonological component. It's a deficit in phonological processing, which is basically all the sub skills your brain needs to be able to process written language with automaticity or automatically behind the scenes. And this is what is not happening in the dyslexic brain. Phonological processing is broken into three primary parts. One is phonemic awareness, the second is phonological memory, and the third is rapid naming. So what do those words mean? So phonological processing is broken into, first, phonological awareness, and this is the term we're all most familiar with. It's all that sound manipulation that starts before we even learn a formal letter. Basically, all the brain's sound ability to break a word down and build it back up based on just its sounds. That also includes rhyming and syllabication. The second part is phonological memory, and it's your brain's ability to attach the letter name and sound and remember them for active use. The third is phonological retrieval, that long-term ability to retrieve that information and bring back those skills in a fast way, right? So these skills aren't working in someone with dyslexia's brain, or they're very weak. Their brains are more likely to see words as pictures and literally not even see the the letters in the word. So when we talk about dyslexia, you can see it in brain activity through MRIs. Now, this clearly isn't an MRI, but it shows you what areas are stimulated in a neurotypical reading brain and the ones that are stimulated in a dyslexic brain. A neurotypical brain is primarily going to use three parts of their brain to read: the parietal temporal area, the occipital temporal area, and the Broca's area. And phonological processing skills are housed in two of those three parts. So a dyslexic child is only using one primary part of their brain to read. And that area isn't intended to work without the other two that do that phonological processing, presenting our problem. But I want you to remember this slide because I'm going to show you how this can be fixed in the fourth part of our presentation, of my part of this presentation. There's so many misconceptions about dyslexia that have existed and still exist. As we gain more understanding of brain science, it's really hard to dispel many of these same myths that have been around since the 60s. The first one is that reversals or seeing words backwards is the main concern. In fact, letter reversals are actually totally normal until the age 7 because of brain development. Dyslexia is not a vision problem, and instead it's an issue with language processing, and hence vision therapy does not cure dyslexia. Number 2, all children have average or above average IQs, or the alternative that they all have low IQs. The truth is that dyslexia exists in all areas of intelligence. What's important to note is that it technically has no correlation to intelligence. We determine dyslexia based on a pattern of evidence which can occur in any profile. Most dyslexics are average intelligence, but it can exist in all levels of intelligence. Number 3, you're not going to grow out of it. It's neurological wiring. It's a neurobiological wiring difference. Once dyslexic, you're always dyslexic. But we can overcome the language processing piece tied to dyslexia. Number 4, dyslexia is not a medical diagnosis, and schools can diagnose dyslexia. And this one really miffs me since it puts a major strain on progress and identification. Number 5, colored overlays are not going to change dyslexia. It's a language processing problem, not a vision one. Now, some kids can have a tracking issue on top of dyslexia, but that isn't going to fix the dyslexia piece. Number 6, all individuals with dyslexia do not share the same strengths and weaknesses. The subset skill weakness areas can be and look very different. Dyslexia is so much more than what people think, and neither one of these top things are true. It's not just writing things backwards. It's not low intelligence. It's all of the things underneath. Dyslexic reading is compensated reading, and it is a misnomer that people with dyslexia can't read at all. They can read. They're just doing it using the wrong part of their brain and memorizing words. They're literally seeing words as pictures and working like 600 times harder than their neurotypical peers. And research shows that when you're memorizing, the brain makes an error 1 in 5 times, equaling 80% accuracy. So here's an example of what that could mean to the comprehension of text. This is also the reason we don't want to set IEP goals at an 80% mastery rate. So this is my explanation to parents about how hard it can be to feel dyslexic, why their kids come home after stuffing their frustrations all day, exhausted and possibly moody. We can all identify with a long road trip. We show up exhausted for no reason after that car trip, just from keeping the car between the lines. But now imagine you're driving, and you're driving in Germany in the mountains on thin, windy roads. And not just that, the rental car company gave you a stick shift. Okay, so we're having to do that kind of focus. But we're also driving on the opposite side of the road that we're used to, and all the signs of German are in German. Imagine how tired you would be. The thing is, a child with dyslexia doesn't know any other way. And so it is such a testament to the drive of so many of these kids. We all know that common 1 in 5 or 20%, and let me clarify, up to 20% of the population is dyslexic. Now, that 20% is showing everyone who has a language-based learning disability, taking into account both genetic and environmental factors, which I'm going to explain more in the next slide. 70 to 80% of our kids in special education have deficits in reading, and dyslexia itself is the most common cause of reading, writing, and spelling difficulties. But the identification rate of dyslexia in the schools across states is anywhere from 2 to 4%. And 80% of those in schools with dyslexia will leave without a diagnosis. So let's look at the root of the language-based reading disabilities and dyslexia. That 20% or that up to 20% represents the reading disability umbrella, but roughly 7 to 10% is what research shows us are genetically based or born with it dyslexic individuals. Whereas the larger percentage experience reading difficulty as a result of environmental conditions, lack of proper instruction, and low language skills. But we typically call them all dyslexia since we don't have that level of data on everyone. And it all reflects the same in testing, whether you're born with it or it happened due to an environmental or language issue. And as it pertains to the red bubble, research shows that up to 75% of kids who have had difficulty with speech sound acquisition have difficulty learning to read. It's all language processing. It's spoken and written language all happen in the same area of the brain. So when we have a kid who had issues with speech or was served under that speech umbrella. Think about them as it pertains to moving into reading. So if dyslexia is as common or more common than being double jointed, having celiacs, being left-handed, having asthma, it's so surprising our schools and general populations still really don't understand it fully. So this is something parents commonly ask me about. We have a report from the school and it says that my son or my daughter has characteristics of dyslexia or symptoms of dyslexia. Does that mean that they have dyslexia or they just show signs of it or traits of it? And the answer is that they have dyslexia. One of the reasons it's written that way in school-based evaluations is because it's a committee decision and we aren't assigning them a DSM code. They are dyslexic, but it isn't the diagnosis, it's not official until that committee agrees. But no one ever takes an active vote around the table. Parents don't realize that they're agreeing, that they're effectively voting, that we all agree, that they all agree when they sign that IEP paperwork. All right. Being that dyslexia is a language processing disorder, we need to break down the areas of language in order to understand the complexity of all the impacted areas. Now, these are a lot of fancy language terms. Some are more well known than others, right? There are obvious areas involved in dyslexia like phonology and orthography, but many are overlooked in the big picture of current school intervention, such as pragmatics, semantics, syntax, morphology, etc. It's a lot more layered than I think a lot of people recognize. And the language acquisition process occurs on a continuum for all people, regardless of dyslexia. It starts with listening and speaking, where there's no instruction needed because the brain acquires it naturally. And we go on to reading and writing, the elements that do require instruction for brain reorganization. Paired with the continuum area is the skill needed for acquisition. And these paired component skills are often areas students with dyslexia struggle with. So we break dyslexia into its primary and secondary consequences. Primary consequences are reading words in isolation, since we do not have the context to apply, decoding words, spelling, and then obviously oral reading fluency. The more strain we have on the brain and struggle with decoding, the more this slows down reading and challenges prosody. That sing-song sound a strong, fluent reader should apply to oral reading. And when you struggle in these areas, it naturally creates secondary consequences, such as a reduced reading experience, reduced vocabulary, a difficulty with reading comprehension, and then written expression as a whole. Since kids with dyslexia do struggle with all of this, it's so much harder to retrieve that word for fluent reading, and they're left with laboring over individual sounds and having to sound out those same words over and over. Here's a sound bite of a child with dyslexia reading. When you're stuck at the word level reading aspect, it makes it almost impossible to retain the meaning of what you're reading. Sorry, guys. There we go.
Second story.
You can say paragraph.
Right? And you can begin.
Dyslexia or any learning disability takes a huge toll on the social emotional self of the child. Here's a commonly used graphic in our industry called the dyslexia iceberg. With an iceberg, they say that what you see is about 10 to 20%, and what is under the water is so much more massive. 80 to 90% of it in its size can be under the water. There are certainly things that we can clearly see, such as trouble decoding word, fluency, spelling, etc. But there's so many underlying impacts that we cannot see that are often so much more detrimental and traumatic, such as anxiety, depression, shame, and low self-confidence and self-esteem. We cannot forget about these when implementing intervention for these kids and speak openly about it. In fact, I was speaking with an advocate last week, and she was telling me a story about this 10th grade boy she's working with who got completely jacked around in the system. And he is currently reading at a 3rd grade level on a good day. And I told her that she needs to put money in for trauma counseling and that compensation ask. Here's an actual account of the way dyslexia makes a student feel. So we like to explain dyslexia as an unexpected weakness in a sea of strength. This was a term coined by Dr. Sally Shaywitz, who I'm sure you guys are all familiar with that name. They often have amazing minds. They see concepts non-laterally. They have fabulous reasoning and critical thinking skills and tons of empathy. They just can't read the words on the page seamlessly. Of course, not all dyslexic individuals have the same strengths, so it's important we don't assume this is the case for everyone. And oftentimes that comes like, it's because of they are focusing, they're putting so much energy, or their right hemisphere is working so much. So we get things like critical thinking and non-lateral thinking skills. Likely you've heard of this new hashtag dyslexic thinking. Richard Branson coined this on LinkedIn. A child with dyslexia's right hemisphere, like I said, is working overtime, and that comes with usually great spatial knowledge, creativity, big picture thinking and reasoning skills, amazing interpersonal skills, and they're just these big picture thinkers. Oh, I already said that. When we read reports, we also very commonly see related G's elevated, such as verbal reasoning and comprehension and spatial reasoning. So it is true that we see this really, really commonly. This video is my most recent gem find. It's a little longer, but it helps to explain those strengths and weaknesses and a reinforcement of what I've said about the dyslexic brain.
Take a look at this impossible figure. Much like the work of the artist M.P. Escher, this shows an object that seems to be three-dimensional, but could not actually exist off the screen. On the other hand, this is a possible object. It could exist in real life. In 2001, researchers performed a unique experiment with images like this. They asked people with and without dyslexia to identify which drawings were impossible. The people with dyslexia proved significantly faster at recognizing the impossible figures. The researchers linked dyslexia with a particular global visual spatial ability to process a whole image versus focusing on it perfectly. This study was just one of several over the past few decades that hinted at something many dyslexic people have only anecdotally known. Though they had difficulty with reading and writing, they repeatedly found enhanced cognitive strength in other areas.
I have kind of like model in my head, spinning around with the entire puzzle rather than just a piece of it.
It brings another layer of thinking and thinking outside the box and the blue thinking.
It doesn't make me superhuman. It's just like how my brain structure is.
Around 20% of the US population has been diagnosed with dyslexia, and their difficulties all trace back to here. The dyslexic brain is structured differently in a way that can create specific challenges, but can also create specific advantages. In terms of human evolution, the brain isn't naturally wired to read. There's not one specific region for reading, like there is for sleeping or engaging our fear response.
Reading is an invention. It is an invention
years old. While there is so much we still don't understand about the human brain, over the past few decades, a clearer picture of how we read has emerged. When we're young, we're activating both hemispheres of our brains heavily, expending energy to learn how to read. But for fluent readers, the brain streamlines more activation to structures in the left hemisphere, like this region known as the visual word form area, which helps us recognize letters and words. And this region, key to mapping letters to sounds, called phonological awareness. For example, breaking up the word cat into the sound ka, a, and sa. And there's Broca's area, which among other things helps with comprehension to understand what words actually mean. Activated areas link together with white matter. There are neural pathways that turn into a complicated highway network that allows fluent readers to process a word within milliseconds. But in the dyslexic brain, these highways and activated areas can look a lot different. Research using brain scans of dyslexic readers showed that there was less activation in these areas of the left hemisphere, suggesting there's often a pathway disruption in these systems that help map sounds to letters and decode words. But people with dyslexia also consistently showed overactivation in the brain's right hemisphere when reading. This could mean that while dyslexic people may have trouble recognizing words and sounds, they're working even harder to compensate elsewhere. The pathway disruptions can also come with challenges in grammar, retrieving math facts, working memory, among other things too. Or often with dyslexia, neural pathways are not disrupted, but just slowed down.
I'm sort of mildly dyslexic. My challenge is more with numbers. Reading out loud in class, you're stricken with panic, and then all the words start floating. You just can't read the words.
Everyone else would be on to doing the exercise, and I'd still try to read the instructions.
Exactly how people experience dyslexia varies greatly. It has no bearing on an individual's intelligence, but today it's commonly labeled a hereditary neurobiological learning disability. Research has found explicit support and instruction in areas like phonology, syntax, and spelling can lead to success for dyslexic learners. But the reading is only part of the picture. Years of research have started corroborating the idea that dyslexic people are prone to advantages, including high-level reasoning, problem-solving, spatial processing, episodic memory, and creativity.
Because I have the picture in my head, sometimes I can make associations between things that they don't appear to be relevant.
Shake it up a bit. You can't get people to think,
Being able to recall stories and recall images, I'll meet somebody, you know. You will have no idea.
While most functions do use both hemispheres of our brains, the right hemisphere is typically associated with skills like spatial abilities and visual imagery. In a study similar to the one with impossible figures, dyslexic people were better able to identify letters in hieroglyphics than other readers. Another study compared the abilities of college students with and without dyslexia to memorize blurred images. Students with dyslexia significantly outperformed. And in 2022, researchers at University of Strathclyde and University of Cambridge concluded that many people with dyslexia are specialized in exploring the unknown. And they suggested that because of how prevalent dyslexia is in the population, the form of cognition plays an essential role in enabling humans to adapt, especially through collaboration between different kinds of people. These new ways of thinking about dyslexia are part of a wider movement to embrace neurodiversity. The idea that brains are simply wired differently, and that these natural variations don't mean they're lacking. Stigma, misconceptions, and a core lack of understanding dyslexia are still rampant. But the more we can learn about differently organized brains, the better we can teach, collaborate with, and empower them, and ultimately change the way we see dyslexia.
constellation of strengths and weaknesses that go hand in hand. You can imagine how much better a child will feel when they know this is not a curse, this is not a decree, this is just a different organization of brain.
All right, and that was Dr. Marianne Wolf. She's awesome. All right, so now we're going to switch gears a little to the misconceptions and lack of understanding the schools have about dyslexia. And this proves that there's a severe lack of education about dyslexia amongst our educators. So remember our myths. 71% of teachers think that covered overlays is a solution. 75% feel that seeing words and letters backwards is the core feature of dyslexia. This one just keeps popping up, huh? And 94% do not think that phonological awareness is a characteristic of dyslexia, whereas in fact, it is one of the largest components. And so let's take it further. 33% of classroom teachers feel that learning issues are due to laziness. 61% are not confident that they could appropriately recommend students for special education testing. And this is one of those most primary individuals on the Child Find team. 51% do not feel confident implementing an IEP or a 504 plan. Goodness gracious. And finally, 70% feel they lack the resources to support kids with learning and attention problems. So what does all this mean? Well, it means that our schools need to make a staggering amount of changes. Teacher preparation programs must begin to first teach structured literacy instruction, and second, train in dyslexia, since it impacts 20% of their students. And the third that I always say too is place in their hands in those K-1, especially ages, curriculum that is supporting all of this, supporting structured literacy. All right, so this is the end of our second part of the 5W series for the 5Ws of dyslexia. If you're interested in learning more, watching the rest of the parts of this, please go to dyslexiaondemand.com to download, free download. The parts that we have left are when do we test for dyslexia? The who is, who do we turn to for that high level appropriate intervention for our kids with dyslexia? And number 5 is where are we going if we don't fix this problem? Thank you so much for joining, and tune back in for parts 3 through 5.